Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dinecko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started.
Hello, everybody. So we've been getting a lot more listens lately, and I'm so glad to see it. But I thought with all of these new listens, and the success that we've had with E. coli and fen so far this season, that we would kind of like reintroduce ourselves and reintroduce the podcast and just say hello to all these new listeners that
Hello.
you might be. So, like the introduction says, I am Kayla Woods. I am an author, and I am trained as a toxicologist, and so that's the inspiration behind this show.
And hello, I am Venus, and I am just a layperson college student who is very interested in true crime and learning about poisons with my best friend.
Yeah, and we try really hard to put out really quality shows, and typically we do talk about true crime cases, and we talk about Lethal Dose, and then we have our Patreon where we talk about like all the extra nitty-gritty things. And this episode is going to be kind of like one of those Patreon microdose episodes, because we aren't necessarily talking about poisons and death, but we are talking a little bit about crime and fraud, and we're delving into a subject that we've talked about here and there in past episodes. And I feel like it's one of those things where, I'll be aware that like an episode is published. I'll see our posts that go up, and I'll see people commenting, and I'll be like, oh yeah, that was published. And then I get thinking about the episode, and I'm like, we didn't talk about this in detail, did we? And it's weeks after we recorded, and there's nothing I can do about it. So we talked a little bit about academic fraud and academic journal publication fraud in the thimerosal episode, and we talked about it in fen. And so we're just going to deep dive into it a little bit more here. So I hope you all really enjoy that. And if you enjoy this conversation, then go check out the microdoses that are available on Patreon that have the same sort of feel as this episode will. I actually have a little bit of experience in academic publication, so I'm going to talk about my experience and let you all know that I, at least at one point, was a very legit toxicologist in the laboratory, even if it's not what I'm doing at the moment.
Might not be doing that now, but you are still an esteemed toxicologist.
Thank you.
Still are. You didn't lose it.
Thanks. I try not to. I try to keep fresh with this show. So, academic publications in journals, we expect them to be vetted, peer-reviewed. They're supposed to be written by people who are trustworthy, like they're experts in their field. They know what they're doing. And then when you submit to a journal for publication, a legitimate journal, you submit it and it gets reviewed by a couple of other people, usually 2 or 3 other people. And there might be several rounds that you go through where they say, I don't know, this figure didn't quite look right. Can you redo this figure, explain this figure better? Or, this sentence doesn't make sense. Like they can, sometimes the peer reviewers like really dig down and they can be really pedantic. And then other times they're just like, overall, this was a good paper. We think it deserves publication. So
like no in between.
Yeah. It can really run the gamut. But I wanted to get into like when this whole process started. Like when did we start publishing information, and was it intended for the layperson at any point, or was it always intended as like
for academics?
Yeah, by and for academics. So The publication of scientific information first began with the Royal Society, formerly called the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge. And this was founded by King Charles II in 1660 to promote science education, and public engagement. So there was a little bit of the public involved, but it was kind of like a secondary goal.
Mm-hmm.
And the latter reasons were the reason that they created their publication, Philosophical Transactions. And this started in 1665, and it was independently run as a pet project by their secretary, Henry Oldenburg. So it was really like one guy who was like, we need to have...
it's important.
Yeah, exactly.
It's his passion.
It was. Yes, it was his passion. The Royal Society also approved books for publication, and they were allowed to do this without going through the censors because, most books during this time, they had to be approved so that you couldn't say, like, the king sucks and then get it published.
Right.
But they received Louis XIV's permission to forego these censors in 1699. Oh. And then at that point, they just kind of published whatever they wanted and whatever they thought was good. And who knows what standards it was. I mean, it was mostly Oldenburg standards,
Right.
And as you would expect, this didn't go particularly well.
No, there's not a whole lot of checks and balances, it seems, at this point.
There are not. Oldenburg died in 1677, and the transactions were carried on by his by the secretaries to the society that followed him. But it was still independently run rather than being run by the Royal Society itself. And so it had like the Royal Society stamp, but it was kind of just like the secretary's pet projects even after Oldenburg. So again, it's like lacking checks and balances. And after a number of satires of philosophical transactions were made, like people making fun
of them, yeah.
The Royal Society finally created a committee in 1752 to vote on what to publish, which is the start of what they eventually began calling refereeing. And they started calling it that in 1817, and this would later become known as peer review.
Okay.
This practice took a while to catch on outside of Great Britain and France, and even by the beginning of the 20th century in 1932, Albert Einstein learned his paper sent to an American journal was going to be refereed, and he wondered why there was any need for such a system or why they would question his authority on the matter.
I mean, yeah, but we need to make sure that everything's above board, Mr. Einstein.
Exactly. And then, publications that we think of as like the tops of their fields, like Nature didn't require refereeing until 1973. So it took a pretty long time to catch on.
Okay.
And, this process has never been perfect, as you can see. But even among so-called experts, once they got involved and once there was a committee, like it wasn't great. For a while in Britain, publication was basically the threshold to get into the Royal Society. So that's, problematic. It's kind of... It's obviously a boys' club. Like, they don't really let women do science, and when they do, their names aren't on the papers. So, and then, people of color aren't going to be included, and it's just going to be, like, your friends also.
There's, like, almost nepotism.
Yeah. And so this process, it caused a rift in the scientific community in Britain because it was so apparently problematic. And then even after, Einstein and his colleagues got used to this idea of refereeing or peer review, it was still a process that people doubted the reliability of. There was a joke that the editors at The Lancet, which unfortunately was the publication that published Wakefield's article on, they joked that The Lancet just took all of the papers submitted for publication, threw them down a flight of stairs, and whichever ones reached the bottom got published.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't good. I mean, that's not
a good system.
Yeah, it's a joke that was their system, but it's, it gets to the idea that
it's not far from it.
Yeah, it just seems random. It just seems random who was published. So, despite the issues with whatever systems were actually in place, it's the whole idea of peer review, the whole system of peer review is still kind of like the lesser of the evils that are available to us in terms of getting scientific information published at all. Despite the many issues that this whole process has, I think that the experts, however you want to define experts,
Quote
th-
unquote.
right, they've always understood that the findings that are taken, reviewed, and published, they create a consensus about how we understand concepts currently, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they're subject to change, they're subject to criticism, retesting, abandonment eventually, if it comes to that because we
Sure.
find new
New
information.
evidence, yeah.
Yeah. So, for instance, more recently, a 2015 paper from Science estimated that less than half of 100 psychology experiments published in 2008 could be replicated, which is kind of a big deal. And
Yeah, I would say that's a huge deal.
right, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the findings were wrong when they were published. They may have been wrong, but it could have mean that they were just not as generalizable as the study may have made it seem, which, is an issue that you have to consider in psychology. Like, is this only applicable to, cis white men, things like that?
Mm.
Or it could be that these studies were taken and then p-hacked to death in order to get a positive finding.
What is p-hacked?
P-hacking is when you take all the statistics that you've gathered and you eliminate things or you group things in a certain way that isn't,
You manipulate the data.
yes. And it's not lying per se, but it's not like the best science, right?
Sure.
And so like when we were talking about weight loss drugs and they only took on people who were healthy and didn't have any sort of like heart issues or any issues related to being overweight, where I was like, see, obviously there's healthy overweight people. That was still them manipulating the data in a specific way. But
Gotcha.
you can do that after you've already collected the data as well, where you can say, okay, well, we're going to eliminate all of the smokers because smokers just, they make it so that our data doesn't look good. And it's like, well, if your data doesn't look good, your data doesn't look good. Like,
Right. Like, that's the point.
right. And as far as criticism, much criticism was made of the fraudulent article that Wakefield published. And that's why ire was drawn in the first place, because experts in the field saw his paper and they were like, we call bullshit, right?
Right.
And, we discussed in a microdose about the strange death of Gloria Ramirez that there were experts who slapped back hard at the article that was published by researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Labs who were like, what is this bananas bullshit that you are publishing in like a pretty well-regarded journal, And criticism is what leads us to attempting to reproduce something, to prove or disprove its validity, generalizability, all of that, right? So criticism is an essential part of this whole process, and it's kind of a secondary part because it happens after publication. And
I see what you mean.
if we can't reproduce the findings or if we find contradictory evidence, then we don't always jump to like it's fraudulent. Maybe it's not fraudulent. Maybe
it's just not the best science.
right, right. And there's investigation that maybe ought to be done there, but it forces us to keep looking to say, okay, well if that's not right, and this one seems right, let's try to reproduce the second one, and see what happens from there. And sometimes we just find that our ideas are wrong. Like there's a lot of topics that you can look at throughout the history of science and say, oh, we were completely wrong about that, like phrenology, or like in chemistry, they used to believe that there were certain bond lengths that impacted molecules, but really molecules just wiggle. And so that was abandoned.
It's always changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that schools try to show this evolution of ideas, especially when they teach about atomic theory in chemistry. And I think some kids can grasp that, and some kids are very confused by that, and they end up growing into adults who are kind of confused by the whole process of like evolving a scientific theory. But we're first taught that Democritus came up with the idea of atoms. Can't be broken down further than that. And then we found, well, that was wrong because atoms are further divisible. There's like more to them. And there's electrons. And then we learn, electrons, they move
They move
around.
around, yeah.
But we first thought that they moved around like planets. And some people, when they envision like a nucleus, they envision the electrons moving around like planets in like rings. And that's not true because then you'd be able to figure out where they are. And Schrodinger and the scientists of the mid 20th century were like, no, it's more like a cloud. You have no idea where they are.
Right.
And when you tell kids all of this, they're like, what model am I supposed to know? I have no fucking
Right.
clue why
Right.
you're telling me all of this. And I think that part of the point is to show that just because we've moved away from one understanding of an idea doesn't mean that the science was bad. It just means that it's gotten better, right?
Mm.
And I think that it can be
They
very
did the
difficult.
best with what they had at the time.
Right. And I think it can be very difficult for people to wrap their minds around that because even in the course of our lifetimes, things that we learned in school in, the early 2000s have changed and evolved and they aren't taught that way anymore or they aren't understood that way anymore. And it can be hard to live your life being, kind of feeling uncertain, feeling like you don't know what's going on. I think that that can make some people feel kind of uneasy. But that's also just the nature of the evolution of ideas. Like we have to get comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
And as lay people, we're at a disadvantage because the way that science is reported on, it tells you that science is changing, but it tells you that science is changing in this fucked up way that is not reflective of how things are actually changing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I published my article that I published, it was about 2 fatal overdoses of mebrocolone, which is it's similar to methoqualone. We've talked about it in, some past episodes in microdoses. I won't dive too deep into it. But these 2 fatal overdoses that we found, one seemed kind of high and one seemed kind of low. And the trend line, if you try to connect those points or find a pattern between those points, it is a straight line. So it looks great. My data looks amazing. But like, it's not reflective of the whole world. Like if you were to take all the mebrocolone doses that have ever happened, which may or may not have ever been captured by other coroner's offices or whatever, because they couldn't, they just weren't looking for it the way we were, then the trend line might move up or down. Maybe they were both high or maybe they were both low. But
with the data you had.
With the data I had, it was just me saying, look, this is what I found. This is going to be the baseline of the information that we start to gather about mebrocolone because I found it first. So here's some interesting stuff. And it was cited for a pretty important book on toxicology. And it was it was accepted by the peer reviewers. And the peer reviewers, I remember one of them said, like, anything that presents new toxicological data like this is important and it deserves to be published. And I mean, they didn't just like publish anything, they were making sure that all of my supporting data was correct. Sure. But they didn't publish it to be like, this single trend line is amazing and, all deaths are going to fall along this trend line. That's not what the point of it was. But we've existed in this environment for several years now where findings like that are just presented as hard fact. They're not presented as a baseline. They're not presented as like the next baby step. It's just, here's how things are.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. And so this is how you have findings, especially those that are presented in the 24-hour news cycle on just like a regular news show, that seem contradictory. That coffee can make you live longer or coffee can actually make you live a shorter amount of time. And it's like, well, how are you measuring that? And what do you mean by that? And both can't be true. So which one is it?
Right.
And, sometimes if you dig, it turns out that it's not even as contradictory as that. Like, sometimes they're just literally reporting the wrong thing.
Mm.
And, a lot of the time it's because the findings of these articles aren't cut and dry. They're not interesting. They're not sexy, It's it's
Mm. Yeah, there's something to read.
yeah, it's sexy if like it talks about you living longer, shorter, losing weight, or literally related to sex. But if it's not any of that, like I don't really know why they're reporting on them, but they just feel the need to report on them and they like, sauce them up. And John Oliver actually had a really great Last Week Tonight episode that is on YouTube, where he talks about this, about how sometimes they'll take the findings of a study and they'll just completely say a different thing. It's almost like the RFK book that I
Right. Yeah, like where
referenced.
did you get this from?
Yeah, that's not at all what it says. And it's really hard as a regular person who's being given this information because you have to look at the details of a study. You have to look at how it was conducted. And not everybody has time for that. And it's
It's a chore reading through something
yes.
like it's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah. And it's boring. It's a little boring. And then you have people like Al Roker of the Today Show presenting this information to make it sound more interesting. He was like, "Well, I'll just listen to whatever suits me best." And it's like, so we're just going to fully admit to
We're
confirmation
fully
bias.
Yeah, wow.
Like on a show that,
It's like
thousands
kind
if
of
not millions of people watch.
millions of people watch the Today Show
Yeah.
and they're just like, "Hey, I'll do that too." Or yeah, I already was doing that. Al
Right.
Roker does it too.
Right. And there's like some amount I don't know how much I want to credit with Al Roker with journalistic integrity, but like there is some amount that you expect. And these media sources that say things like that, they lie about findings. It's like, where is the journalistic integrity? It's hard enough
Mhm.
to understand the findings of these articles, especially if you don't have any experience reading them, or even if you do, honestly, even if you
Right.
do. And then you have, sources that you're supposed to be able to trust because of journalism, and you just can't because they're just talking heads.
Right.
And honestly, those people are just the tip of the iceberg because politicians who you would think that
Um
we could trust because they are literally guiding the the direction of our lives and we have ostensibly voted them in trust.
entrusted them.
They're outright disagreeing with the consensus of experts in favor of conclusions that benefit them. So I have a couple of examples here that we're going to watch. So here is uh, Ron DeSantis of Florida. And I'm not meaning to pick on the Republicans here, but they have a tendency to say stupid shit.
Make no mistake about it,
Yeah.
we've seen a concerted effort to ramp up the fear when it comes to things like global warming and climate change. For example, the Oxford English Dictionary noted that between 2018 and 2020, the use of the phrase climate crisis increased 20-fold and the phrase climate emergency 76-fold, making it their chosen word of the year in 2019. Now, this is driven by ideology. It's not driven by reality. In reality, human beings are safer than ever from climate disasters, as the death rate from climate disasters has declined by 98% over the last 100 years. And the number one reason for that is people that have had access to reliable electricity and power.
So yeah, it's great to cite the dictionary for sure when you're talking about climate change, but also his statistic that he uses is true that technically people are safer than ever from the effects of climate change, but it's not because of access to water. Experts say it's because of access to infrastructure to protect them and forecasting that allows them to know with enough
When a storm's coming.
right, and they can do something about it. And not to get overly political here, although it's kind of unavoidable in this case, and I've done this to myself. But Project 2025, which is kind of, you know, feeling itself out in Florida, wants to privatize weather forecasts, and so
What?
they are
Like,
intending
that's
to take that away.
literally dangerous.
Yes, yes. So we
Like
will
right
be.
now, like I have a friend who's getting ready for the hurricane that's getting
Hmm.
ready to hit, and if they just didn't have access to the information other than like, oh, why are the stores all out of bottled water? Like,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know what I like?
right. Or even if they know, it's like, I don't know when it's supposed to hit. I don't know how bad it's supposed to be.
Right.
Yeah. So
Wow.
yeah, his statistic is right, but he's intentionally manipulating it for his
Wow.
own. I do have a Democrat example, so here we go.
And autism, I think, is a prime candidate where we've seen just a skyrocketing autism rate. Nobody knows exactly why. There's some people who are suspicious that it's connected to vaccines and triggers, but this person included. The science right now is inconclusive, but we have to research it. Part of the reason I think it's very important to research it is those vaccines are also preventing huge numbers of deaths among children. And
Yeah, so I did have to dig a little bit for that one, but yeah, that is Obama in 2008, and he has since changed his position on this and said that vaccines are not dangerous and they are not linked to autism. But it was dangerous for him to say this when he did. It was dangerous for
It's
him.
dangerous for him to tiptoe around it like that.
Yeah, and to give credence to the idea that vaccines might be related to autism.
Yep. Yep.
And then we have a short clip from Marjorie Taylor Greene. So, for context, a reporter says there are children, skinny people who have died of coronavirus, and this is Marjorie Taylor Greene's reaction.
It's dangerous.
Do you feel any responsibility for keeping people in Georgia safe? There are children, skinny people who have died of the coronavirus. Do you feel any responsibility
TA,
for the people
crack
of
me up.
Georgia?
You know what? I think people's responsibility is their own. It's dangerous.
So, yeah, she's saying that it is everybody's own responsibility to take care of themselves. She doesn't believe in vaccines, or I don't think she even believes in the coronavirus, and she doesn't believe that it has harmed, people who are not
Millions
obese.
of people.
Yeah. And now she's saying that it's people's responsibility to deal with it on their own. And it's like, it's your responsibility as an elected leader to take the information that we have and to help guide us in safe directions. And it's clearly not what she's invested in. And then, like I said earlier, you have RFK Jr. writing a book and citing papers that literally contradict him because he knows no one's going to check his citations if they do read his book. Or he also cited sources, as we talked about, the experts within the community might know to be biased and wrong. Like, I know he cited a paper that was talking about mercury, but it was talking about the wrong form of mercury. And
well, that doesn't count.
you wouldn't know that unless you were an expert in the field and you realized that it was the wrong form of
Right.
mercury. And so it can be very hard, even if people are trying their best to follow the
Educate
sources.
themselves
Yeah,
and- yeah.
when they're just outright lying. And then there's the issue of accessibility. Like, say you are somebody who's really driven to find the information and get to the root of something and figure out who among all of these people that you can trust. Can you trust the scientists? Can you trust the politicians? The accessibility is an issue because despite the fact that some research is funded with public tax dollars, and you would expect as somebody who is a member of society that you would get access to the results.
Right. I paid for that.
Right.
Like,
The results of good research that's done well, that's vetted, that isn't p-hacked to death, it often sits behind paywalls.
ugh.
And shitty research that's not done particularly well is freely available, which is not to say that all open access research is poor research, because there is a movement to get things out from behind the paywalls and give people access, but how are you supposed to know which is which, right?
Yeah, as a layperson, I don't know. Like, I don't know.
And the open access information that is good and out there hasn't improved since I was a student, a decade ago. So it's a very slow process. And there is the wrong, some might say illegal way of doing things, which I may or may not have to engage in order to find papers on this podcast. But the money that you're, stealing, that you're taking away from engaging with that paywall by going around it, it all goes to the publication. It does not go to the researchers. It does not go to the organizations. I haven't made a cent off of the research that I did, nor do I expect.
Just for the cause.
It was for the cause, yes. But the paper that I published in is making money off of it by putting it behind a paywall and, getting subscription payments. And so when you look at all of this together, it can look like scientists don't have our shit together. It can look like we're not trustworthy. It can look like we don't know what we're doing. And, people are people, and to a degree, some of this is true. People not having their shit together, people being biased. That's how the Andrew Wakefields of the world get through the cracks. And in The Lancet, like he had his bias. He was published in a reputable paper. People called out his shit, but it didn't get redacted for years. It was still up. It was still up for years.
Permeating the landscape,
Yes, yeah. And then also in the thimerosal, I mentioned that Wakefield slipped through the cracks twice because he slipped through with the Lancet, and then there was the Rolling Stone article. And I do want to say that when I was talking about that, I didn't mean to equate the Rolling Stone and the Lancet as reliable publications on the same field. But he did get through two systems of publication that you would think would have good vetting to some degree because of journalistic integrity,
Right.
And again, it's not like the Rolling Stone is necessarily I don't even know what a good example is.
Yeah.
I want to say the New York Times, but the New York Times is a very flawed publication as well that you can't always trust because they have very clear biases much of the time. So it's really hard to know what publications you can trust. But this is where I come back to peer review. It's the least bad option that we have. It's not great. Fraudulent articles can get approved for publication in what you might consider to be reputable journals. And it's not just the Wakefields, and it's not just hacking for capitalist gain. But it kind of does come down to capitalism, because capitalism is usually at the root of all evil, right?
As it is. As the story goes.
So scientific research, whether it's done by undergrads for a PI who's a professor at their college, or by grad students trying to get data so that they can get their degree, or if it's private or by industry institutions, it's all part of this larger culture of publish or perish.
Oh, that sounds terrible.
It's scary.
Yeah.
And luckily I didn't feel this pressure as much, but it is a very, very real driving force out there that if you don't get the data, if you don't publish something, you won't get the funding or the promotion or the degree. And then you continue to rot away in labs, accruing student loans, or you end up staying in the same job and not moving, or you could lose your job if you don't publish.
Oh, wow.
So it really incentivizes people to try to find loopholes. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky enough, I guess you can say, to have an advisor who saw negative results as still being results worthy of reporting. In my thesis defense for my master's, I quoted Thomas Edison when he was asked how it felt to fail over and over and over and over again to invent the light bulb. And he replied with something to the effect of, "I have not failed 10,000 times. I've successfully found 10,000 ways that will not work." And I quoted him because my own research on determining the concentration of tetrabromo-BPA in baby food somewhat similarly determined many, many, many different analyses that did not work. And I think my PI, after I graduated, she did abandon that research ultimately. She only has so much she can do with the funding that she has.
Right.
But should she decide to pick it up, should anyone else decide to pick it up, my thesis is out there with all of the ways I do not recommend that people use. And it's not
The
like that's,
handbook for what not to do.
yeah, and it's not like that's necessarily a bad thing, you know? If somebody's like, oh, I'm going to do this way, I'm going to do it on GCMS, my thesis will very clearly be like, no, 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 no.
Not the way.
Not,
This is not the way.
yeah. But many universities and companies do not see negative results that optimistically. A 2010 study that was examining this publish or perish push for positive results across all disciplines. They took as many papers as they could find. And they found that papers with negative results are less likely to be cited or published at all, and instead languished away in desk drawers and on hard drives because they are probably out there, but they are not being published. And they could kind of tell that that was going on. And one of the fields that it's actually worse in is toxicology.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they said that toxicology and then also biology, there was a correlation with productivity of papers that were put out and positive results, which indicated that a lot of people were putting out positive results and not a whole lot of negative results or partially positive results. And the implication here is that we are possibly doing things over and over and over again and not knowing that we're doing them wrong. And we're not willing to publish these negative results because we only want positive results. But the more insidious possibility that couldn't be examined by this study, but which kind of presents as a possibility, is that the research may have been fraudulently manipulated to appear to support a positive or partially positive outcome in order to be published.
Oh, just for the sake of being published.
Yeah, so they might have, done some sort of p-hacking with it to try to twist it up so that it showed positives where they did not exist. And the fact that there were many, many papers being published in toxicology that indicate more of a positive correlation than maybe is natural among, the number of findings that were put out, it does give me reason for pause to say, like, what is not being put out? What are we not saying? Are we showing that there's correlations between certain symptoms or conditions that don't actually exist?
Yeah.
And most of the research that is being done in toxicology is already being done in animals, which, animal studies don't correlate to humans 1-to-1. So there's already a lot of issues that we could pick apart. But what are the greater issues that we can't even be aware of because of this publish or perish nature of publication? And sometimes the fraud is actually even worse than that.
Oh.
So in 2022, China was the world leader in scientific research output and was credited with 23.4% of all of the research conducted worldwide.
Oh,
I mean,
wow, I didn't know that.
It's a very large country, but also they are putting out a significant amount of research. The following year, though, Hindawi, which is a subsidiary of the academic publisher Wiley, which is, it's a reputable publisher that I often use, and so do many other people. But this subsidiary retracted over 8,000 articles with Chinese co-authors.
Oh.
This record-breaking amount of redacted articles caused damage so bad that Wiley announced it was going to stop publishing through Hindawi.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Further analysis conducted by Nature found that there were 17,000 retracted papers from Chinese co-authors and authors between 2021 and 2023.
So they're doing a lot of junk science too.
They're doing, well, it might be worse than junk science is the thing.
Oh.
Some of these retracted papers came from paper mills that sell fabricated work or ghostwritten work, which is also considered fraud because the person claiming to be the author didn't do the research, who knows if they're lying, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of ethical ramifications. But so in the Fen episode, I mentioned that the pharmaceutical companies making the drugs were hiring doctors willing to sell out their ethics and were writing articles to support the drug. But this is another one where, it published and I was like, maybe I should have emphasized what was happening. Because that was happening at the beginning. And then once research started really picking up that showed that fen-phen was dangerous, that it was causing heart problems, that it was killing people, the pharmaceutical companies doubled down. And they didn't just double down by saying, no, that's not true, and by hiring doctors that would, continue to sell or continue to be the face of the company. They were hiring doctors who engaged in this practice, and they were paying for papers to be published that said that fen-phen was safe.
Yeah, that's dangerous.
It was
That's
super
malicious.
dangerous.
Like that's not this like, oh, I need to get published so
Right.
that I can further my career. Like, no, you're harming lives.
Yes, yeah, they
Like,
knew it was
there's-
killing people.
Yeah, there's a big distinction.
And so some of these may have been ghost written by the doctors, whatever. But it sounds like no matter what was going on, they were paying to have their articles published, and it is obviously much easier to pay to have many, many, many pieces of junk science or bullshit published than it is to take your time, do good research, have it peer reviewed, and then have it published in a
Right.
reputable paper. So it's just putting out a slew of shit that says, no, these people are wrong, and they're, libeling us essentially, when it's like, no, you're killing people. You are killing people.
Yeah.
And so this is where I will introduce us all to the idea of predatory journals, which have long existed for profit.
Because capitalism.
Because capitalism. These are publications that follow lax or non-existent peer review procedures, so they don't even have the lesser evil going on here. They exhibit questionable marketing schemes, and they start contacting people who publish as soon as you get something published. They started contacting me saying, hello, Dr. Woods, would you like to publish in our journal? And it's like, I'm not a doctor. You've not done your research.
Yeah, whoa, slow down.
But if you're a researcher who needs to publish something, or a company who needs to get your citation out there for your dangerous
Right.
drug research,
Right.
then you just might pay. And unfortunately, these publications are only becoming more rampant with the open access movement, which is a really disappointing
That
side
is
effect.
disappointing.
Yeah. It is estimated that by 2015, over 500,000 papers were published in predatory journals.
Holy shit.
Yeah. Sometimes, however, the papers coming out of these paper mills or being submitted to give someone the Hail Mary they need in their career are completely fabricated. It's not ghost written. It's not
It's just
hacked.
actually like bullshit. Like they actually phoned it in.
Fake data, fake text, fake photos. And with artificial intelligence and models like ChatGPT, this problem is only getting worse.
Now they can just polish a turd.
Yes, that's exactly what they're doing. And we're now to the point where some experts who are investigating AI-generated fraud articles estimate that they might account for 500,000 papers published every year out of the
Wow.
2 million total articles published annually.
So 25%.
25% could
Wow.
just be made up bullshit.
Wow.
And the way that they're looking for these articles, because, when I say 500,000, it's like, how do you even track down 500,000 AI articles? So the way that they're doing this is the same way that anyone identifies text created by a generative language model. All these AI models do is they plagiarize from past work. And so there are some words that they overuse, like delve, innovative, undoubtedly, fresh, scholarly, commendable, things like that. So you just have to look for these key words. And like when I first heard this, I was like, I've used Delve. And it's,
You used Delve earlier in the episode.
yeah. And it is a natural thing to use, but that's why they are latching onto it. And if you look,
Because it's used so often, they're like,
Yes.
we like this.
Yes.
This is used often.
And so I'll post on social media some of the graphs that show it, but there is a huge uptick of articles that use Delve. It's not just like a normal up and down. Here's generally how many times it's used. It has exploded.
Huh.
But so, I don't like to give listeners information and then be like, well, that's how life is. Enjoy having that information in your head now. I do like if I can give you something actionable. So what can we do that is actionable? What can be done? If you're someone who often references academic papers, you can look for authors who use private, non-institutional email addresses and those whose affiliation is with a hospital. And obviously you're going to get some, false positives because affiliation with a hospital, you know, doctors are obviously going to put which hospital they're working out of to give them some credence. And I myself am guilty of putting my private non-institutional email address on my paper because I was leaving the coroner's office when I published and I wanted to be able to...
You're like, I need to get it. I need to receive anything that has to do with this, any
Yes.
correspondence, and I'm not gonna be here.
Peace out. Yeah. So it's not a perfect system, but it can raise a
helps.
little red flag, and then you
Sure.
can review the paper a little bit more with a little bit more scrutiny to find image manipulation, to look for fake data, plagiarism, which is a big one. I mean, you can say like, I and my colleagues, we did some research. Here's a little citation, and we're moving on from there. That is different, though, from just being like, I know this because I said so, and then not giving any
right.
peer-reviewed citation. And then there are also watchdog groups that look for these retracted papers, and they try to keep an eye on what's going on.
But when there's a 500,000 retracted,
I know. It's hard. It's really hard. It's a huge, huge problem right now. And so it's not just something that you can look for the thing at the bottom of the article that says this was retracted, this was edited, things like that. Like you really
Right.
have to
You really have to put in the work.
You do. And, if you're not somebody who often references academic papers, but you try to keep up with things, it can be really hard to figure out if you're being lied to or not. It's like I said
Yeah.
before, you can't know if you can trust the New York Times or Rolling Stone or the Today Show, and it's just, who can you trust,
Kayla Woods. That's who I trust.
I do try to do my best, and I am open to people being like, hey, this paper that you cited turns out to have been bullshit, which would be really unfortunate because I do try to really watch my shit. But I'm open. I'm open to people sending me criticisms. That's how we all get better at things.
That's how we learn.
So I hope if you're new to the show that you're finding that I'm really on my shit. But if I'm not...
She is. She's a stickler. She puts in a lot of hard work on these episodes, y'all.
I try. I do love it. And I really like to see that a lot more people are enjoying it, and I would love some feedback, good or bad. I'm open to it. Give us, in terms of feedback, give us some ratings on all the places where you're getting this.
Spotify, YouTube, Apple, all the places. Click the buttons. We'd love to know what you think.
Tell your friends about it. Follow us on social media. You'll hear all of this in the outro. But yeah, I would love to get some feedback now that we're getting a ton more listeners. I'm super excited for the rest of this season to come. And I did want to say that we do try to put out episodes regularly, but if we fall off here or there, it's not because
life
is life. Life really is lifing lately for the two of us, I'll be honest. So we're going to try to keep up with a somewhat regular schedule. But if not, I will let you all know on social media if we're taking a hiatus or anything like that. If I don't say anything, you can expect an episode to come. Yeah. And we do try to keep up with Patreon. Even when things are slower on the main channel, we do really keep up with our patrons because we really respect that you're giving us money for what we do.
Yes. And we appreciate you.
Yes. And we appreciate everyone who's listening. Your support means so much. It
really does. This project started as just a little idea baby some years ago, and look at it now.
We're almost 60 episodes in. This might be the 60th episode or something like that. So
dang.
Yeah. So thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this one.
Here.
If you liked it, go check out more over on Patreon that has this sort of feel to it. And you can currently sign up for a free 14-day trial on Patreon where you can see all the bonus content we put out and then, see if you like it. See if you want to stick around. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye. Bye.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Venus. Stay safe, and remember,
The dose makes the poison.